It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Andrew Bowie, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Miata Fambula of the New Economics Foundation and Christopher Hope of the Daily Telegraph. Today, the Chancellor defends his policies to help with the cost of living.
Some of these things are difficult, they're certainly unpopular, but they're responsible and will help us in the long term. And I'm not going to deviate from that just for some short-term popularity gain.
It comes as millions of us brace for higher energy bills from tomorrow. Also today, thousands of us have offered to provide homes for Ukrainians. Should we do the same for Afghan refugees currently living in hotels? Transgender athlete Emily Bridges is told she can't compete in a cycling event this weekend. Is that fair? We hear from a campaigner for transgender rights in sport. Jeremy Corbyn enthused thousands of young voters. Can Keir Starmer's Labour Party do the same? And the Partygate story resurfaced this week, but is Boris Johnson's leadership no longer in danger? As you heard there in the headlines, millions of us will receive higher energy bills from tomorrow and see higher tax take in our pay packets from next month in April. We saw Rishi Sunak there as well at the top of the programme. Let's listen to him a little longer on BBC's newscast, an interview he's done being broadcast tonight.
I know it's tough for people. We're facing a very difficult situation with the price of things going up. The toughest part of this job is not being able to do everything that people would like you to do, because we're already borrowing quite a large amount of money, and and I don't think borrowing lots more would be sensible. Actually, it has the risk of making the problem worse when you've got inflation and interest rates going up. So those are the things I'm trying to balance, and within that, how best to get what types of help to what people. Those are the choices I made, and I feel confident in those.
When you go out campaigning, Andrew, are you confident Rishi Sunak has got the balance right between protecting the public finances and protecting households?
Yeah, look, nobody's going to pretend this isn't tough. And it is about getting the balance right, which is why, it was very good to see us raising the threshold for national insurance last week, the 5 pence cut in fuel duty, measures that will actually benefit and support those who are struggling. But nobody can deny that there's people out there who are really feeling hurt by the incoming rise in energy prices, the cost of fuel at the pumps and everything else that's going up as a result of inflation. But as the Chancellor said, if we borrow more to continue to, if we just threw money at the problem by borrowing more, it would actually have the effect of a detrimental effect in terms of inflation. That would just make the problem much worse. So we've got to take sensible, measured steps, and we are supporting those who are struggling most. And of course, we would love to go further in a world where we could just pull money out of the air. But we can't do that. We've got to be very sensible and manage, and that's why we're taking the action we're taking just now.
Rishi Sunak is confident he's got that balance right. Are you?
No, clearly it's going wrong. We're looking at £2,500 more for most families in terms of the costs that they're facing, and actually much more for people who are renters, because it's mortgages that are going up, it's energy bills that are going up, it's the cost of food that's going up. It's a toxic mix. And the challenge here, Andrew, is that actually it costs us a lot more when people end up with too much month at the end of their money. And there are things that you could do. You could bring in a windfall tax on the energy companies. They have made an absolute packet in the last couple of years off the back of these prices, and we could help people with the bills that they're going to get next month. And also, you'll know, because you're replacing Ed for this week, you won't know, but one of my bugbears is the cost of childcare. There's a massive crisis in this country where people are paying a lot more for childcare, which means they can't go to work, which means they can't pay the taxes. So actually, it's a very short-sighted approach that Rishi Sunak is taking.
Look, Stella,
and we know it's going to have to change. We all know it's going to have to change. The problem is we need to tell people when, because they are struggling right now.
I'll come back to you in just a moment. It is a balancing act, though, isn't it, Miata? It is a balance between an awful lot of things when you've got rising inflation, costs are going up, and you're looking after the public finances.
It is a balance, but I think when your watchdog tells you that we are seeing the biggest squeeze in living standards since the 1950s, that is probably the thing that ought to be the priority. And actually, when the Chancellor's on course to generate a surplus in 2 years, he's essentially doing that off the back of people suffering. He could have acted, he could have done more, absolutely. He had take away borrowing, he had headroom within his budget in order to do more, particularly for those at the lower end. So for me, I can't understand why he didn't act in the round to help people, but particularly those at the sharp end of this crisis. Absolutely nothing. People on social security, absolutely nothing within that spring statement. And he had options. That windfall tax is an option. There were tax mechanisms that could have hit tax on wealth. He had options and he chose not to take those options, and people are suffering as a consequence.
Do you buy the balancing act?
Well, it goes to the heart of Rishi's problem for a lot of Tory MPs. He's not very political. I think he doesn't quite see what's happening here. Boris Johnson, ahead of the spring statement, was quite keen to do something to guarantee energy prices after the October review. The next big political problem is going to be the review of the cap in August. It comes in on the 1st of October. Then you've got maybe 800 quid extra on bills.
Do you think he'll come back, though? That's what most people expect.
Almost certainly, and that was the problem, and because it can't be addressed until the next budget will be in November, so we'll be in the summer.
You say he's not very political, but there is that promise of an income tax cut, of course. That's pretty political,
That's 2 years away. That was quite as Mayata says perfectly there, but that's 2 years away. It's subject to also other pressures, wars, anything else happening. I think that was a clunky way of doing it. It wasn't a clever way of doing it.
Listening to what everyone has said, should he have done more?
Well, look, I heard Stella, and obviously I understand the attractiveness of a windfall tax. But the idea that it would solve all of our woes right now is for the birds.
But it would solve
frankly.
some of them, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, oil and gas companies at the minute, contribute 40% in tax on their profits already. In my part of the world, in my constituency, where they are a key economic driver in terms of employment, any windfall tax would actually have the impact of creating instability and insecurity in the North Sea. And at a time when we've got to focus on...
The chief executive of Shell got £6 million in pay and dividend last year.
Yeah.
I think the oil companies have made quite a lot of money.
And he will be
and they could
a high
pay
level of
more.
tax on that
and
salary.
It's our constituents.
And that's right that he does.
Don't talk over each other. Don't talk over each other.
We're talking about £600 on average we could give back to constituents.
Yeah, but that wouldn't cover £600. Let's just be clear. It would, but we haven't heard from Labour clearly where they would get the rest of the money from, unless it is from that headroom that the Chancellor's got. So you would borrow more on top of that.
There is headroom, as Mayata said. There's also, what do you invest in that pays a return? And I say childcare again. When people are having to leave work because they can't afford childcare, that is a cost we cannot afford.
This is the government.
This is why they've got to come back.
Final childcare across the country. We've taken the lowest paid out of income tax altogether, raised the national insurance threshold, which will benefit 70% of people in this country. And of course, what we're doing on fuel duty and everything else. Of course, we understand that people are going to be struggling, and it's going to be tough. And that's why we're taking the action that we are.
And you can watch the full interview with Rishi Sunak on BBC One tonight at 11:35 if you're still up, or audio version available on BBC Sounds later on. Let's talk about refugees, because a number of prominent Conservative MPs are amongst the signatories of a letter addressed to Michael Gove, the Cabinet Minister, calling for more support for Afghan refugees. One of the ideas they suggest is incorporating a Homes for Afghans strand into the Homes for Ukraine scheme. One of the MPs is the former Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green, and he explained how it could work earlier.
I think it could work if you asked faith groups, military charities, businesses, civic groups to organise the permanent relocation of Afghan families, actually to...
So they'd find the houses, would
they? They would find or rent the houses and do it in an organised and structured way with some reasonable financial support behind it.
Do you back the scheme, the idea?
I certainly think it's worth consideration. Yeah, I think the Homes for Ukraine scheme has showed what a warm-hearted and open nation that we are when it comes to welcoming in those people who are seeking refuge from war-torn areas around the world. I had the pleasure of meeting some of the officials who are working on the Afghan relocation scheme, and these people are really dedicated individuals who are working very hard to try and find permanent residences for people who've come to this country from Afghanistan. And every individual case has its own issues. And so they're working determined to try and find the right solution to all this problem. We all recognise that a long-term solution for this is not housing refugees in hotels or in other areas like that across the country. So, yeah.
Because that is the current situation, isn't it, for Afghan refugees at a huge cost to the taxpayer
absolutely,
as well.
And it's not suitable for anybody, not least those refugees. So we need to look at solutions, and all options should be on the table.
Right, all options. But do you actually favour a scheme like this? Would you like to see homes for Afghan refugees?
I'd certainly like to look at it in more detail, but it's certainly not anything I would dismiss out of hand.
Right. Should the Labour leadership have been arguing for that, for Afghans fleeing Kabul last year?
Well, we all have been. I mean, I've got some of these cases in my constituency. I've got a family
specifically for UK families opening up their homes to Afghan refugees.
I would like to have this scheme because right now this country locks up women who have been victims of rape in conflict. We've just had an urgent question on this, but we lock them up in a place called Yarlswood, and then most of those women do not get deported because understandably they have a claim to be here in the UK. So we pay a huge amount of money to incarcerate refugees when actually community sponsorship schemes are a lot more cost effective. So one of the conversations we need to have is what is a better and more productive way to manage our refugee crisis. The challenge here with the Afghan refugees is that they have been left and abandoned, because I've got cases and they've just, I'm sorry, Andrew, they have. I've got families with little babies in one hotel room who've been there for 7 months.
But I still haven't heard, Stella, from you saying, would you like it to be replicated?
Actually, what I'm saying is we shouldn't make it about someone's nationality. We should look at community sponsorship as part of the way in which we support the refugees.
I agree with that. I completely agree with that. If you're a refugee in this country, you should be treated in the same way, no matter where you're a refugee coming from. I completely agree.
I mean, and the response to Afghans fleeing their country and refugees leaving Ukraine has differed in many people's minds. What is that down to, do you think? I mean, is it down, part of it, to practicalities, which is what Damien Green said? He talked about family groups tend to be bigger from Afghanistan than the ones coming so sadly out of the Ukraine, or is there more to it?
I think it's because it's a European war, and that's what's focused attention is on our continent. I think that's as far as it goes. I mean, it's an issue. It feels very close to home. It feels like flyable for a city break to Kyiv, as you would do in peacetime, and that's why it struck Britons in a different way than Afghan, which further away and somewhere else.
Miata, do you agree with that? Because one of the other practicalities is also about places in schools. It's also about places at GP surgeries, and because there is a feeling that many Ukrainians will want to return to Ukraine. That may not be the same with Afghans.
Well, I don't know, but I think what's very clear from all of this is that we have a very piecemeal ad hoc approach to refugees. You know, the fact that we have one approach for Ukrainians and another's for Afghan and, let alone Syrians or other refugees, I think tells you everything that's wrong with the system. And I think we do need to have a proper system that says when people are fleeing conflict, we open our borders, we do it in this way, we allow safe passage, we have a process for processing people that is humane, isn't cumbersome, is quick, and we settle them.
Right,
the key piece is settling them, which isn't just about homes, but it will be about education, will be about the right to work. So I think we need to look at the whole thing in the round. And the tragedies that we've got, Borders and Nationality Bill, which could, by the way, be doing that, but instead is potentially criminalising refugees that come here through non-safe routes.
The difference is economic migration and refugees. I think that's what's happening here. You've got people fleeing a war zone, many women and the elderly with children from Ukraine, whereas the issue is being with Syria and Afghan, whether they want to stay in, and it's more of an economic issue, and that's the concern. And well, they'll stay for longer, not return.
But it's the Taliban. I've got a man who's taken 7 nephews, and he's now in a hotel room with these 7 little boys.
That's completely wrong, obviously, once they get here.
But that's the Taliban. They are all refugees. What we need is a proper process to return them. We need to be really careful about separating out. And the suggestion that somehow people fleeing from Syria and Assad might be economic migrants, but everyone coming from Ukraine is a refugee. Because then there's a brutal question here about whether it's the colour of someone's skin rather than the persecution that they face that's a challenge here. And we have to be honest with ourselves. The British people did respond to the Afghans, by the way. I mean, I was so proud of the way my community spoke up. Absolutely. But there wasn't a scheme in place. Yeah. Now is the right time to ask ourselves how we fulfil our obligations.
Well, and on that scheme, in terms of the bureaucracy that Miata mentioned, your colleague Andrew Gwynn was sitting here yesterday responding to the issue of the scheme, which Lisa Nandy, your colleague, called a DIY scheme, because you have to match families with Ukrainian refugees. He said he would support the visas being waived. Would you?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which you can do it. You can do the visas at the site. There's a much simpler way of doing the processing. I do want border checks because it's one of the best ways that you stop trafficking. But what's happening now, I've only managed to get 1 Ukrainian family here in the last week or so, and yet we've got people here who've even filled in all the paperwork, so it's clearly not working.
No, I agree.
There's time for a new consensus on how we make sure we...
It should be quicker, it should be simpler, it should be much smoother, but you're absolutely right, the border checks do need to remain, but we should be able, in 2022, to find a better way of doing it.
But you could do those as people came here. That's what Andrew's talking about. You don't need to wait and make them go off to Paris and Calais.
It's a cheap shot to say it's a race issue, which you were saying there. It's not the case. It's merely that you've got women and children here fleeing. They've left their men in the country to fight the Russians. They want to go home. They want to mainly stay near the country they've left from. That's different to people coming from further away, where they're coming as entire families.
What do you think is happening with the Taliban, Christopher? What do you think is happening with Assad? What do you think is happening in Eritrea?
Let him answer.
Obviously, it's dreadful. I mean, you can't compare different
That's not economic.
crises.
It's not to do with the gender of people. It's persecution. Being a refugee isn't something that comes as a result of where you live.
But you've made it very clear. Is it about colour of skin in the way that Stella is saying? Right. Andrew?
No, absolutely not. Definitely not. But actually, we should use this moment and learn from how the Homes for Refugees scheme has worked to try and better improve how we deal with all refugees who are coming to this country.
I agree, and I hope, look, the opportunity is that it does shift the debate around refugees, which I think has been very toxic and coarse, and actually leads to a sensible set of conversations. And, even community placement schemes, those households that are doing that aren't getting huge amounts of support from the government in terms of grants to actually do that. So it's a sort of short-term stopgap, which will help in the here and now, but we need a proper system.
We need the safeguarding. We want to be very clear. This is not about just offering somebody a home. It's making sure it's the right home, making sure it can be for someone to settle. That person who stepped up and taken his nephews because his male relatives have all been killed by the Taliban needs not just school places, but those children are going to need mental health support.
But does that take time? But that takes time, does it? I mean, does it take time?
Does it take 8 months, Jo?
Well, no, maybe not 8 months.
Which is what we've seen, because the Afghan refugees just seem to have been left in the hotels, and someone said, well, who's going to sort this out? Is it local council? And local councils need support to be able to do this.
Right.
But we're talking about a small number of people in comparison to what other countries are doing. It is great to hear you, Andrew, say actually there is a time for a new consensus. But that means we also need to get rid of the nationality bill, because that is going to set us back so far in the way in which we can then manage these
I disagree,
situations.
Stella. I don't think it will.
The nationalities bill is going to criminalise even the Ukrainian refugees, so they don't come here through the routes that, at the moment, we all agree aren't working properly. That can't be right.
What the Nationality and Borders Bill will do will help us crack down on illegal immigration, actually crack down on people trafficking.
Hang on. Just explain, though, just very briefly, because we have got to move on. Illegal immigration, what is that?
People who come to this country through illegal means, as people who are, not refugees fleeing war, not economic migrants, people who come to this country, do not apply for asylum and seek to stay here. That is illegal immigration, and that's something we need to stop. And the British people expect us to deal with that. But we are an open and welcoming country, and when you are fleeing, when you're seeking refuge from a war-torn country, then this country will always give a place for you.
All right. It is a reinterpretation, though, isn't it, or a different interpretation of existing treaties, just to be clear?
Yes, I would suppose. Yeah.
But the key point is, if you don't have safe and legal routes, people will take, in desperate circumstances.
Which is why we have to improve and make better use of
you don't criminalise them, you make the system better. You don't criminalise them, you make the system better.
We're going to move on. We're going to talk about Emily Bridges. Let me just show you this story, BBC Sport. Transgender cyclists will not race in Women's National Omnium event. Now, Emily Bridges isn't competing. The BBC have sought clarification for why she's been excluded, but the governing body has yet to respond. We're joined now by Natalie Washington, a trans woman who advises sporting organisations on trans issues. Welcome to you. What was your reaction, first of all, to the news that Emily Bridges would not be able to compete?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. It's a strange one, isn't it? We don't know a lot about what has caused this situation. I mean, my first reaction, frankly, is I'm sad for Emily. I'm sad for those around her, her family. As a trans woman competing in elite sport, it takes an awful lot of courage to put yourself out there and to do that in the current climate where trans identity is, frankly, under a huge amount of regular attack. So she will have, I know, undergone an awful lot of abuse and an awful lot of harassment, frankly, for putting herself forward and doing this. So it will have been very brave for her to get to this point where she's entered, and now that's been taken away. We don't know why. Rumours of some sort of paperwork issue, but it is a bit strange.
Right. The context, of course, Natalie, is discussion about the fairness of her competing based on biological differences. Do you understand those concerns, have sympathy for those concerns about it not being a level playing field?
Oh, I mean, I completely understand why people would have concerns about, fairness in sport with regard to trans people, with regard to anything else, particularly at the elite level. Of course, this is often these people's livelihoods. It's what they work for all their lives. So, of course, people want to have the confidence that they're participating on a level playing field. And, of course, in cycling, this has been a hot topic for decades now for all sorts of reasons. I think a lot of the debate, let's say, about trans people participating in elite sport, it has a lot been driven by a lot of misunderstandings around what being trans actually means and what a medical transition might look like.
Yeah.
So if we take Emily Bridges, for example, and I know she's participating in research at the moment to understand more about this. I've participated in research myself. We need more on that to understand more, but it's a commonly misunderstood perception that that trans people are just, that trans women, for example, enjoy all the advantages, the biological advantages that a typical man might enjoy, and medical transition kind of negates a lot of that. And we have research which sporting policy is built on that shows us that that's the case, and we have to trust that research at the moment.
All right.
But the public tend to misunderstand that, unfortunately.
They misunderstand it in what way? That they don't really believe the research, or they still look at it in the way you've just described, that there'll be more strength in a trans woman, perhaps? Yeah,
I think that that's naturally what a lot of people think, because a lot of people think, well, a man is typically stronger than a woman, and nobody really disputes that, of course. There's lots of outliers, but in general, that's the case. But when people undergo typically hormone replacement therapy, that typically means some sort of, for a lot of trans women in the UK, that means some sort of GnRH analog, which will, I would describe it as nukes your testosterone level, makes that very low, typically has an impact on your sporting performance,
right,
within around a year, is what the research typically tells us.
All right, I'm going to bring in the rest of the panel, but Natalie is going to stay with us. The exact reasons, as you've heard, Andrew, are not clear, but as I understand it, this is a global body's decision for cycling, because apparently Emily Bridges did meet the criteria from the British governing body. What do you make of it?
Yeah, obviously, we need to see the full details, and your heart goes out to Emily Bridges. As it was just said, these athletes, in fact, trans people in general, are amongst the most abused and marginalised people in society, and we must do much more, I think, to support them in whichever sphere of life they are in. So we need to have a very sensible and sensitive debate about this, especially in terms of participation in sport. But we also need to make sure that those competitors who are born women, who are so inspirational to women and young girls across the world in whatever sphere they're competing in, have fair access to compete in elite sport as well. At the end of the day, it is about fairness. But this is such a sensitive issue. I think it has to be dealt with the sensitivity that it deserves, and we need to have a lot more in-depth research into the effects and the biological and all the rest of it. But your heart goes out to the individual concerned, because it takes a hell of a lot of courage to put yourself up there as a transgender athlete and take part in the way that she has been doing.
Beata?
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I think, in the end, the question of fairness, I don't think we can make sweeping statements about it, because the research and the evidence isn't there. There's still research that's being done to understand if there is an advantage and what happens after hormone replacement therapy.
But until that research is done completely, do you think it is fair then to allow someone like Emily Bridges to compete?
I think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. I think it's complex. I think it's nuanced. I don't think it's black and white. And so each case should be taken on its merit. But for me, I have to say that this whole debate about trans people, transgender rights, I think feels like it's being done in a way that's just trying to dump on trans people and alienate trans people. And I think we have to be really, really careful, because, as you say, they face huge amounts of abuse, huge amounts of discrimination, violence. And, there is a real struggle about access to healthcare, access to mental health. And that is what I'd love the debate to be about. But it feels like it is often shallowed and debased to talk about issues that are just divisive and don't go to the heart of what it is that...
I couldn't agree more. I think it's certainly debased by, slagging matches across radio and television studios about, penises or cervixes or the rest of it. This needs to be a sensitive debate. It's so important that we get this right for the people concerned, and I couldn't have agreed more with what you just said.
Well, shall we just listen to what the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, said? He gave an interview to Unheard yesterday. He was responding to the story, but it was, I think, ahead of the decision that has been made to say that Emily Bridges can't compete.
It should be about sex rather than gender, and sex should be based on your biological sex.
Do you agree with him?
I don't think a blanket ban any more than a blanket approval is the right way ahead of this. I also think all the sporting bodies should be coming together, and I thought that was right for Cycling England to say, actually, we do need a policy on this, because we are talking about, the trans community in this country is about 500,000 people, and within that, the elite sports community is a very small group of people as well. So I don't think, frankly, it's for the health secretary anymore, it's for me. Neither of us are experts in the science or the biology to be able to make that call. It should be that the sporting bodies, and it should be across all sports, that they have this
Although
conversation.
Politicians have got involved in this discussion, rightly or wrongly, but they have.
Yeah.
They've been asked questions, but they have also got involved and taken a stance and got into problems and into hot water because they're not able to articulate it. Would you admit that? Even Keir Starmer.
Oh, because what we need to say, look, a woman is an adult human female, and most women have vaginas and cervixes, but some have penises because they were born men, but they have become women. Actually, I think what the British public want us to do is to treat this with the kindness, because they see that the trans community is being attacked, and they also recognise that some women have concerns. Understanding and addressing those concerns cannot come from those kind of shouting matches or discussions about what's in someone's underwear. It can only come from looking at the science in these competitions, because we know that biology matters. It's just not the end of the matter, and that's what's important here.
Well, let me just show you this headline in the Times. Chris, if you believe in fair competition, trans cyclist Emily Bridges should not be racing Laura Kenny. The transgender debate is sensitive, but if a 21-year-old novice can beat the greatest female track cyclist that Great Britain has ever produced, sport has a problem.
That was the problem with this one, because you wouldn't want to devalue her achievement by allowing this to happen, because it appears that this poor individual here has been pushed, where the science isn't there yet, so they can't say it was a fair competition. And it's really, really hard, I think, for Emily Bridges to have to go up against this and be talked about in a political debate, frankly, when she's done so well on her own.
I mean, when we're talking about a level playing field, is there ever a completely level playing field? I mean, in the sense that you could argue that funding differs between various athletes, and also height and strength on the basis of being...
And I hope we would agree that still in the fact in some of our major sporting competitions where men get paid more than women, that is unfair too, because the ability to be I mean, fair play to anybody who can cycle that fast, because I know I could never achieve that level of ability. But if we're looking for where there are gender divides that we also ought to be challenging, because that is outright discrimination, let's talk about the pay that you get in the different games.
At the
heart of this is a 21...
I mean, you
I've just said, Chris,
Strategy, I've been answered in 5 words.
I've just said a woman is an adult human female, and some women are born and some women become women.
It's not a biological issue or a gender issue.
Biology, of course it plays a part in it. It's just not the end of the matter, Chris. I'm sorry, I know that people want titillation in all of this, but actually,
I don't think people want titillation.
They see it as somehow a killer question.
That in a way, our viewers, we've done and talked about this endlessly on this programme. I don't think it's fair to say that everyone wants titillation. What people want is to be able to talk about it freely, because it's not an easy discussion to have.
I had answered that question, and Chris has raised it, but I've said it several times. What I'm very mindful of is that the levels of suicide and self-harm within that small trans community in this country are a legion, but also we're talking about the battles for equality and the fight that women have and the damage that patriarchy is doing in this country. It is so much bigger, and it's not caused by trans women. It's absolutely caused by a community. You know, today, Parliament yet again will be looking at whether misogyny should be part of hate crime, for example.
All right, well, we'll talk about the issue of patriarchy.
That's not important.
Let's go back to Natalie. What do you make of the discussion you've heard so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, people have clearly identified that this is an emotive issue for people. I'm glad to have heard mentioned a couple of times that actually at the centre of this is a community, transgender people, that is undergoing an awful lot at the minute, has an awful lot of problems, one of which we heard from Sajid Javid, right? The NHS is struggling massively with trans healthcare at the minute. There are people waiting 5-6 years just to be seen. So, like, this is a community that is struggling at the moment and needs to feel, frankly, a bit of love from society. So at the centre of all of that, we've got a few individuals every now and again who you might get an opportunity to do something for the community and to show that trans people can achieve something. And I'd love for us to be able to start celebrating that instead of having to have a conversation every time about, is this fair? Is this right? You know, Emily Bridges pre-transition was an exemplary cyclist in boys cycling, you know, broke the junior 25-mile record. So this is someone who, if they competed in men's cycling, would have been an excellent competitive cyclist. So, of course, it stands to reason that as a woman, she would be an extremely competitive cyclist in women's cycling as well. So we've got to create a situation where these people can achieve something. And when they achieve something, it doesn't all become, oh, well, they shouldn't be competing anyway, because they have a right to be there just like anyone else does. And of course we have to do research, and of course we have to make sure that it's a level playing field in sport. But there's so much more in sport as has been mentioned, that isn't a level playing field. Funding is not fair. Access to facilities is not fair. There's so much that we can also do to get sporting fairness right between boys and girls and men and women in this country and beyond, that we shouldn't just focus on, frankly, a few individuals, and it really is only a few individuals, trans people participating in sport at an elite level. They're not the end of, women's sport as such, as you sometimes hear.
Natalie Washington, thank you very much for joining us today. Let me show you this headline. On a different subject, Rolling Stone, can Labour win again with young people disillusioned? The article claims that without the empathetic draw of Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, or inspiring left-wing ideals, the Labour Party is in trouble. Let's talk to Simon Childs. He's the journalist who wrote the article, joins us now from South London. Simon, what exactly is Generation Left?
So Generation Left is an idea put forward by Keir Milburn. He's a politics professor at Leicester University, which says that basically if you grew up or became an adult around the time of the financial crash or afterwards, you form part of this kind of coherent political group that has a different experience of life and capitalism, basically, than what went before. So that's a group that found a lot that resonated in what the kind of change that Jeremy Corbyn was putting forward. And I think we're quite politically homeless before that. And then now, since, the 2019 election result and Labour did very badly, I think they find themselves politically homeless again. And that's kind of what I was reporting on.
What were the changes that the group of people we're talking about liked so much about Jeremy Corbyn's policies?
I think it wasn't just about left-wing policies, although that was part of it. I think it was this sense that Jeremy Corbyn wanted to do things differently, and it was more participatory. And I think the way that, following that election defeat, you had Keir Starmer running on a platform basically saying, I'm kind of like Jeremy Corbyn, but I don't have quite as much of the baggage in terms of the anti-Semitism scandal and things like that. So I'm a more electable version of Corbyn's platform. And then since then, we've seen him kind of putting forward a strategy of just completely disavowing that project and saying there's absolutely no continuity whatsoever between Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
All right.
And I think that's why a lot of young people feel this sense of political homelessness now.
Right. Listening to that, Stella, what do you make of that thesis? How can Labour win back those disillusioned young voters?
Yeah, look, I think we also have to have the humility on the left to recognise that this is a trend that predates Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader, about young people wanting to move to the left, but not necessarily translating into voting. And I'm very mindful that although there was an increase in support amongst young people for the Labour Party, that didn't actually translate into membership. For example, actually, the Labour Party membership got older, not younger, and I think all our political parties are facing that. So there's a genuine question for all of us.
I think we can say that pretty confidently, certainly on the Tory side.
Not you, obviously.
Thanks very much.
I think there's a recognition that we have to inspire and engage people in politics. Look, the biggest challenge I see right now is that people are losing hope in the idea that anything can be different. Frankly, things like Partygate, when you see prime ministers, when you see people breaking the rules, actually it becomes a plague on all our houses. And that's why I think across the House people were so frustrated by it. It goes deeper than that. It goes deeper in people's sense about, can change really happen? And that is the mission that all of us on the left have, which is to inspire and engage everybody in the possibility not just of being an opposition, but being an alternative. But I am very, very mindful that these are longer-term trends that we have to respect and engage with if we're really going to address them.
Right. I mean, has the political system, the main political parties, failed young people, Miata, in terms of the policies that they had? If you think about university tuition fees, exorbitant rents and house prices, I should say, school closures during the pandemic. I mean, it feels as if young people have had a really bad time.
I think they have. I mean, I think the settlement that they now face is a really, really rubbish one, which is why so many of them are angry. So many of them hanker for change. And, I remember one sort of young activist talking to me about the Corbyn project, and they said, look, it's not Jeremy Corbyn. Like, he is a lightning rod for a movement that's here, and actually we're looking at the economic deal that we're given, we think it's rubbish. We're looking at the planet we're going to inherit, we are disgusted by what the previous generations have done, and we want change. And they organised and they mobilised, and that project was a lightning rod for them, but actually that movement's still there, you know, and I think the Labour Party would do well to tap into those people because their energy and their desire for change, I think in the end is the thing that's going to shift our politics. And at the moment they're looking for where is the thing that gives them hope that something better than what we have can be done. And my God, I hope our politics can do that for them.
Simon?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, you know, if the question is how does the Labour Party engage young people? I mean, I think it did that a few years ago, and a lot of the Labour Party didn't really like it and tried to get rid of the guy who had engaged young people who, like him or not, was Jeremy Corbyn. And I think, yeah, it's interesting to turn the question on its head rather than can the Labour Party appeal to young people or Generation Left. It's more like, what does that generation do now to advocate for change? You know, you're seeing an increase in activism around climate change. You're seeing people going on BLM marches. And I think, yeah, where that energy goes, whether or not it's with the Labour Party, is going to be an interesting political question for the next decade or more.
Stella, you first, and then I'll go.
Well, I mean, I think, look, we're facing a situation where you can inherit £1 million from your parents in property, tax-free, and for communities like mine where kids live in families where they are renting properties, they will never access that money. So a lot of opportunities, not just in terms of higher education, but are all cut off. And so those, but for those young people, I'm very struck by.
But just to answer Simon's point about Jeremy Corbyn saying that they found him attractive, and a lot of people in the Labour Party didn't.
But
I mean, we know that, and they didn't.
Can I answer the question? Because what I'm trying to say is that actually that group
you're
of
answering
people...
it in a different way to what the question that Simon was posing.
No, I'm trying to answer it from what I see as somebody who's done a lot of work with various youth movements. And Miata's right, like there is an energy in some of the consumer grassroots movements. My point is actually that energy was there pre-2015. And for some of us who've always spent our time coming from a campaign background trying to check them in, absolutely, Jeremy was better at talking to those movements. What we have to have the humility to recognise is that didn't translate necessarily into participation within the Labour movement or into activism. That doesn't mean that I don't accept that challenge. And for me, as I say, tackling the fact that the kids in my community who are saying to me, I will never have those opportunities that those kids who've got the bank of mum and dad behind them is the biggest question. We do that through the Labour movement, but we also do it through tapping into the community movements they're in part of.
All right, and what's the Tory party got to say?
Well, firstly, I'm not surprised that young people don't know what the Labour Party stands for, because frankly, I don't think anybody at the minute knows what the Labour Party stands for. But, you know, I don't like the idea of talking about young people as some sort of homogenous blob that all believe the same thing. I mean, Stella said young people want to move to the left. Not all young people do. You know, I was vice chairman of the Conservative Party for Youth, and I spent 2 years speaking to young people across the country. And we had an increase in membership of the Young Conservatives over that period, a substantial increase of thousands into the Conservative Party. But you're absolutely right. We have a generation. Well, I hope the Young Conservatives did. But I mean, this is a generation that is very angry and very disillusioned, not least with how they feel they've been treated over the course of the last 2 years.
And who's been in power? And who's been in power since 2010 in terms of dealing with?
Well, we were, you know, dealing with a global pandemic over the last 2 years. So, you know,
but previous to that,
we've got to make sure that the answers that we have for them, the solutions that we have, the policy ideas that we have moving forward, speak to this generation.
Well, what would those be? What would those policy ideas be to attract people like Simon?
Well, I mean, frankly, and I'm probably not going to be too popular for saying this within the party, I don't think the Auger Review in terms of student finance is moving in the right way to encourage more people into higher education. We need to build more homes across the country where they are required to get more people on the housing ladder. And we need to talk about the issues that young people actually care about and absolutely dealing with.
Well, I'll have retired by the time you built all those homes.
It's a long way off.
Sorry, Chris, you wanted to...
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think there's a disconnect completely. I mean, what they should do is vote in big numbers and march and organise. I mean, that's what's happened. The party, the average turning from Labour to a Tory supporter in their 40s now, I think, wasn't it, the last election? They're more like to vote the older people, so they get more of the pension tax break, the triple lock, I should say, was seen as a reward for voting for Conservative all those years. I think that it's more about engaging. I mean, certainly worry about it. I mean, Corbyn didn't get in because his policies were unacceptable to most of the other parts of the country, but they were acceptable to a group of young people, possibly. But you know, you have to sort of engage with the process, and you might get some results.
I mean, can Labour appeal to what we call the former Red Wall voters and young voters at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the end, I think it's sort of common cause. People are looking at the fact the economy doesn't work for them, and also, by the way, doesn't work for the planet. People are looking at the settlement. They're looking at the fact that we've had a decade of stagnating wages and living standards being squeezed. Those are the core issues that people care about. And whether you're in the Red Wall or you're a young person thinking about your prospects, those are bread and butter issues. So I think any party that can say, we see this, it is rubbish. Quite frankly, it is rubbish, and we can do better. And this is what change looks like. And by the way, it's not tinkering, it's proper change. I think can appeal to all those voters. So I think that's what people want across the country.
We also have to recognise this is probably the most engaged, educated and politically active generation ever, thanks to social media and all the rest of it, that we've ever dealt with. So when we're talking about issues to this generation, they know what they're talking about, and we can't just fob them off as we have in the past.
Simon, final word from you?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that there are still people engaging, young people engaging with the Labour Party, and they're finding it an increasingly hostile place to be, because I think the party says it wants youth engagement, but maybe not these young people who they find a bit too left-wing. So it kind of can't have it both ways.
Oh, do you have sympathy with that?
I don't recognise that.
You don't recognise it?
I don't recognise that, but I do recognise there is a challenge in, when people are facing £1,000 extra on their rent, and a lot of young people think, I'll never ever own my own home, I will never ever be able to get out of debt. They need better answers on those issues. And actually, your government isn't saying anything about them. The challenge for someone like me is to convert that into...
I spent 2 years of my life talking to young people, trying to get their ideas, trying to get their policies listened.
Because actually, the young people joining my local party meetings are desperate to stay in the local community and can't because rents are rising.
All right, Simon, Charles, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about the Conservative Party in the last few minutes of the programme and Boris Johnson's premiership. It appeared to be in jeopardy as the Partygate scandal raged, and some Conservative MPs called for him to resign. It didn't reach the 54 letters needed for a confidence or a leadership election, and then the war in Ukraine came into focus. But Partygate is back, as you know, in the headlines this week, particularly with the 20 fines that are being issued. The Prime Minister hasn't received one yet, some people may say. Is he safe, Chris?
I think his future's tied a bit to Ukraine. If Ukraine starts calming down, I think the Tories will go back into looking at what happens to them. The May elections become very important. I think Boris Johnson, he's made quite clear, I think he won't resign himself. He may be forced out by Andrew and his colleagues, maybe in the Scottish Tory party, who seemed pretty unhappy about him a few months ago. With Boris Johnson, I mean, 6 months ago, he'll be in charge for 10 years. During Partygate, it was 10 weeks, and now we're back to maybe he might survive this first term. So it's quite a roller coaster, but I think he's quite tied to foreign affairs at the moment. That's his security blanket.
Well, you said he was in trouble. I mean, the last time you were here with me was for the defection of Christian Wakeford.
I will remember clearly.
Yeah, we'll all remember it. But you said he was in trouble. What's changed? The fundamentals haven't changed.
Well, I think what's clear is we've got a war in Europe in which Boris Johnson has been leading the international coalition against Vladimir Putin. Frankly, I think it would be incredibly naive and wrong of us right now to talk about removing a leader who's taking such strong action in uniting the West.
But you said I think the Prime Minister
Putin.
should be considering his position. I mean, what has changed in terms of the way you viewed the Prime Minister? Yes, there is a war in Ukraine, but why has that changed how you feel about the Prime Minister in terms of leadership? You said the country needs leadership.
Yeah, the country doesn't. I think Boris, over the past 2 months, has shown that leadership. And I think we need to move past where we were a few months ago. We're in a very different place right now. I think he is getting on with the job in terms of uniting the West and condemnation and action against Putin. In fact, it was only 2 weeks ago that the Labour Party thought the same thing, by the way. And taking action on the cost of living issues, which is what he should be doing and what the country, frankly, expect him to be doing.
All right, well,
we should be supporting him in doing that.
All right, well, it's great. There's been this volte-face from you and others. The Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, who was really even more clear about him going, but has changed his mind for now. The Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson refuses to say number 10 parties were illegal. The Met Police says some of them were because they've issued fines. Were they illegal?
Well, look, the Met Police haven't concluded their full investigation. We haven't seen the full Sue Gray report. I think before we actually cast judgment, we should wait for those processes to complete. And in the meantime, we should support the Prime Minister in doing the job that he's doing right now.
Were they illegal, those parties?
Well, fines are issued, therefore laws have been broken. I mean, it's a QED. It seems like it's a funny head to dance on if you're the Prime Minister.
Right, well, before we go, I'm just going to tell you about a documentary made by the BBC's Laura Kunsberg, which is all about the political changes she witnessed in her 7 long years as political editor. And boy, the landscape has changed. It's called Everything Has Changed, and it's available on BBC iPlayer. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests, some of whom have been the regular panel for the last few weeks. But thank you to all of you, and to you, Andrew, for joining us today. I'll be back with Politics UK tomorrow, and Politics Live will be back after Easter. Do join us then. Bye-bye.